think one thing we should have learned from the 20th century, but of course didn't, was that there's something extraordinarily dangerous about totalitarian utopian visions. That's something Dostoyevsky wrote about in his great book, Notes from Underground, because Dostoyevsky had figured out by the early 1900s that there was something very, very pathological about a utopian vision of perfection, that it was profoundly anti-human. In Notes from Underground, he demolishes the notion of utopia. He said, imagine that you brought the socialist utopia into being, and human beings had nothing to do except eat, drink, and busy themselves with the continuation of the species. He said that the first thing that would happen under circumstances like that would be that human beings would go mad and break the system, smash it, just so that something unexpected and crazy could happen. Because human beings don't want utopian comfort and certainty. They want adventure and chaos and uncertainty. And so that the very notion of a utopia was anti-human, because we're not built for static utopia. We're built for a dynamic situation where there's demands placed on us and where there's the optimal amount of uncertainty.
Notes from Underground is a novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky, first published in 1864. The book is divided into two parts, a first-person narrative of the underground man, a bitter and isolated civil servant, and a third-person account of his later interactions with society. The novel explores themes of free will, rationality, and the nature of human consciousness, while offering a critique of the emerging ideas of utilitarianism and rational egoism that were gaining popularity in 19th century Russia. The underground man's psychological complexity and his scathing criticisms of contemporary society make the novel a classic of existentialist literature.
Part 1 of Notes from Underground is a first-person narrative told by an unnamed narrator, commonly referred to as the Underground Man. The Underground Man is a retired civil servant living in St. Petersburg, Russia, who has isolated himself from society due to his extreme pessimism and disgust with the world. The narrative begins with the Underground Man describing his own personality and nature. He explains that he is intelligent, well-educated, and possesses a strong will, but is also weak, indecisive, and plagued by irrational fears and anxieties. He is filled with self-loathing and believes that he is incapable of ever finding happiness or fulfilling his desires. The Underground Man then goes on to describe his view of society and his feelings of isolation and alienation from it. He believes that human beings are fundamentally irrational and self-destructive, and that the idea of human progress is a myth. He sees society as a crystal palace built on the suffering and misery of the masses, with the upper classes exerting their power over the lower classes through exploitation and manipulation. The Underground Man goes on to recount a number of anecdotes from his life, illustrating his feelings of powerlessness and frustration. He tells of a time when he was humiliated by a group of soldiers on the street, and another when he insulted an old schoolmate out of spite. He also describes his failed attempts at romantic relationships, and his belief that he is fundamentally unlovable. As the narrative progresses, the Underground Man becomes increasingly bitter and unstable. He begins to question the very nature of rationality and free will, arguing that human beings are incapable of making truly rational decisions. He argues that even if a person were given perfect information and could see all the consequences of their actions, they would still act irrationally due to their own desires and impulses. The Underground Man also begins to express a desire for revenge against society and a desire to exert his own power over others. He describes how he enjoys exerting his will over his servant and fantasizes about exerting his will over others in more significant ways. He is deeply self-aware of his own flaws and contradictions, but is unable to change his own behavior. In the final section of Part 1, the Underground Man turns his attention to an imagined confrontation with an imagined man of action who represents the ideas of rational egoism and utilitarianism that the Underground Man despises. He argues with this figure, attempting to prove that human beings are fundamentally irrational and incapable of true freedom. Overall, Part 1 of Notes from Underground is a dark and often disturbing exploration of the nature of human consciousness, the limits of rationality, and the isolation and alienation that can come from rejecting society. Through the character of the Underground Man, Dostoyevsky creates a vivid and unforgettable portrait of a man consumed by his own contradictions and unable to find meaning or purpose in the world. Part 2 of Notes from Underground is a third-person narrative that continues the story of the underground man, but shifts the focus to his interactions with others in society. The narrative is divided into two sections, the first of which takes place 20 years after the events of Part 1. In this section, the underground man receives an invitation to a dinner party hosted by an old schoolmate, Zverkov. Despite his misgivings about attending, the underground man decides to go, hoping to reconnect with his old acquaintances and prove that he is not as weak and pathetic as they remember him to be. At the dinner party, the underground man is immediately reminded of his own inferiority and isolation. He is mocked and belittled by Zverkov and his friends, and is unable to assert himself or gain their respect. He becomes increasingly bitter and resentful, and ends up getting into a physical altercation with Zverkov. After the dinner party, the underground man becomes obsessed with seeking revenge against Zverkov and his friends. He spends weeks planning an elaborate scheme to humiliate them, but ultimately fails to carry it out. Instead, he ends up humiliating himself in front of them and further cementing his position as an outcast. The second section of Part 2 takes place several years later, and the underground man becomes romantically involved with a prostitute named Liza. The relationship is significant because it represents a potential for the underground man to break out of his isolation and connect with another human being, but it also highlights the depth of his alienation and his inability to escape the patterns of self-destruction that have defined his life. The underground man first encounters Liza at a brothel, where he is initially dismissive of her and her profession. However, he is struck by her beauty and her innocence, and begins to see her as a potential source of redemption and connection. He pays her to spend the night with him, but their first encounter is fraught with tension and discomfort, as the underground man struggles to connect with her on an emotional level. Over the course of their relationship, the underground man becomes increasingly enamored with Liza and begins to see her as a symbol of the hope and humanity that he has been missing in his life. He tells her of his dreams and desires, and she responds with empathy and compassion, even as she struggles to understand his complex emotions. However, their relationship is ultimately doomed, as the underground man's self-destructive tendencies and his inability to connect with Liza on a deeper level lead to a series of misunderstandings and conflicts. The underground man tries to push Liza away, telling her that he is not worthy of her love and that he has only used her for his own selfish purposes. Liza is hurt and confused by his sudden change in behavior, and she eventually leaves him to return to her life as a prostitute. The underground man is left alone once again, but he is left with a sense of regret and longing for what he has lost. His relationship with Liza represents a fleeting moment of hope and redemption, but ultimately underscores the deep-seated alienation and self-destructiveness that define his existence. The narrative ends with the underground man alone and isolated, consumed by his own bitterness and regret. He realizes that his attempts at exerting his will over others have only served to make him more unhappy, and that his desire for revenge and power have ultimately led to his own downfall. Overall, Part 2 of Notes from Underground is a powerful exploration of the destructive nature of isolation, bitterness, and the desire for revenge. Through the character of the underground man, Dostoyevsky shows the reader the consequences of rejecting society and the importance of finding meaning and connection in human relationships. The novel ends on a note of despair, but also offers a glimmer of hope that the underground man may one day be able to find redemption and connection with others. In Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky, the underground man devotes a significant portion of his monologue to criticizing the philosophy of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist ethical theory that holds that actions are morally right if they maximize happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people. The underground man takes issue with this philosophy, arguing that it is deeply flawed and ultimately dehumanizing. The underground man begins by criticizing the idea that human beings are simply calculating machines that are capable of rationally determining the best course of action for maximizing happiness. He argues that this is an oversimplification of human nature, and that people are motivated by a range of irrational and emotional factors that cannot be easily quantified or predicted. He goes on to argue that the utilitarian philosophy can lead to the oppression of individuals who do not fit into the majority's definition of what is good or pleasurable. The underground man asserts that utilitarianism can justify the oppression of minorities or individuals who are seen as being a hindrance to the happiness of the majority. The underground man also argues that utilitarianism ignores the importance of individuality and the human experience. He claims that the utilitarian philosophy reduces human beings to mere cogs in a machine, and that it fails to appreciate the richness and complexity of individual human experience. Finally, the underground man argues that utilitarianism is inherently self-contradictory. He asserts that if every person were to follow utilitarian principles, the result would be chaos and unhappiness. He claims that the pursuit of individual happiness and pleasure can often come at the expense of others, and that a society in which everyone is simply pursuing their own happiness would be fundamentally unstable. Overall, the underground man's critique of utilitarianism is a powerful statement against the dehumanizing effects of a philosophy that seeks to reduce human beings to mere instruments for the production of happiness. His arguments are a testament to the importance of human individuality and the complexity of the human experience, and serve as a warning against the dangers of blindly pursuing a philosophy that promises to maximize happiness at any cost. Rational egoism is a moral theory that holds that individuals ought to act in their own self-interest, and that rational self-interest leads to the greatest overall good for society. The underground man takes issue with this philosophy, arguing that it is fundamentally flawed and ultimately leads to a nihilistic and self-destructive way of life. Nihilism is a philosophical belief that denies the existence of inherent meaning, purpose, or value in life. Nihilists believe that life has no ultimate significance or worth, and that all beliefs, values, and moral principles are ultimately baseless and without objective truth. Nihilism can be a rejection of religious, moral, or political principles, and is often associated with a sense of despair or hopelessness. Some nihilists see the rejection of traditional beliefs as liberating, allowing individuals to create their own meaning and purpose, while others see it as a nihilistic abyss that leads to existential dread and despair. The term nihilism comes from the Latin word nihil, meaning nothing. The underground man begins by asserting that rational egoism is based on a flawed conception of human nature. He argues that human beings are not simply rational creatures who act solely in their own self-interest, but rather are motivated by a range of irrational and emotional factors that cannot be easily quantified or predicted. He goes on to argue that rational egoism can lead to a kind of paralysis in decision-making, as individuals become so consumed with their own self-interest that they are unable to act decisively. The underground man asserts that a truly rational individual would not be paralyzed by their own self-interest, but would rather be able to balance their own needs with the needs of others. The underground man also argues that rational egoism can lead to a sense of isolation and despair. He claims that when individuals are solely focused on their own self-interest, they become disconnected from the larger society and are unable to find meaning or purpose in their lives. He asserts that a truly rational individual would recognize the importance of human connection and would seek to find meaning and purpose in their relationships with others. The underground man passionately defends his belief in free will, arguing that human beings are not simply determined by their environment or by their physiological makeup. He asserts that individuals have the ability to act irrationally, and that this capacity for irrationality is what makes human beings truly free. This belief in free will is significant because it sets the underground man apart from other deterministic philosophies of the time, and represents a belief in the power of individual agency and choice. However, it also leads the underground man to make self-destructive decisions that undermine his own well-being, highlighting the complex interplay between free will and human nature. The underground man believes that human beings are not simply driven by rational impulses or by the laws of cause and effect. He asserts that people have the ability to act irrationally, to make choices that go against their own self-interest or against the expectations of society. He sees this irrationality as a fundamental part of human nature, and believes that it is what makes human beings truly free. However, the underground man's belief in free will also leads him to make a series of self-destructive decisions. He sees his own irrationality as a way of asserting his individuality and defying the expectations of society, but his actions only serve to isolate him further and to undermine his own well-being. The underground man's belief in free will is further complicated by his awareness of his own limitations and his sense of futility. He recognizes that his actions are often driven by unconscious impulses and that his sense of agency is limited by his own psychology and by the circumstances of his life. However, he remains committed to the idea that individuals have the power to act in ways that are fundamentally free and that are not determined by outside forces.